Hi, this is Dr. Nick. I'm the incrementalist here with incremental insights for better business, better health.
And I'm Fred Goldstein with Accountable Health here, helping companies with their employee health and benefits programs.
So, Fred, you've been roaming the world with CO2 sensor in hand, scaring people. What's been going on?
Yeah, as we talked about the last time, I got the sensor, and as you can see right now, the room I'm in is measuring 680, 698. Yeah, so I've been traveling around with this on airplanes, at a conference, in rooms, etc., just measuring it randomly as I go, and it's really been some fascinating stuff. So the way this works is they're looking at the background concentration of CO2 in the air, and because we as human beings expel CO2 as we breathe, if you put humans or other animals, mammals, etc., into a room and they're breathing away, they're going to go ahead and increase that CO2 concentration unless you're changing that air out. So it's a pretty good way to understand what kind of air circulation you have in a enclosed space or outdoors. And the typical outdoor measurement that I've seen is 400 to 500, and apparently normal background is 250 to 400. And if you're in an indoor space that has good exchange, you're going to see 400 to 1,000. Once you get to 1,000 to 2,000, you can have issues with drowsiness, and it's considered poor air. And above 2,000 to 5,000, you start seeing headaches and things, and it can be considered stale air. So as I went around the country and in and out of these rooms, I would pop this baby out and I would turn it on. One of the interesting things is it beeps initially, so people obviously get a little nervous, and it was set to beep at 1,000, which is where the air level starts to be considered poorer quality. And so as I did this, the first area where I really noticed an issue was, believe it or not, Nick, and we've talked about this a lot off the air, is airplanes. You know, airplanes are supposed to have these great systems, right? You probably know that better than I, so maybe you can talk a little bit about what the airplanes do.
Yeah, so they're promoted and positioned, and in fact, papers. In fact, United did a whole study, I think, with the Mayo, could have been the Cleveland Clinic, I forget. They had mannequins, they had all of these sensors, and the modern day airplanes essentially have a very significant airflow that comes from the top. It's sucked out in the bottom. It's segmented by about 2 to 3 rows at a time. So if you're in that section, you're getting the same sort of circulation of air. And it's being HEPA filtered in the air conditioning packs that essentially manage all of that, and promoted not pre-COVID-19 as a preventative and healthy is probably a little bit strong, but a positive approach to preventing any transmissible diseases by virtue of that whole system. Yet you seem to have found something that contradicts that.
Yeah, and that's true. And perhaps not necessarily contradicts in a sense, but clearly is in that high range that is considered not satisfactory clearing the air. So one of the interesting things was the first flight I was on was a Southwest flight to Denver, and I pulled it out and had it on my seat thing in front. I had a row to myself. And I was consistently getting 1,300 to 1,400 parts per million of CO2, which is in that range of considered poor air. Certainly you're not clearing enough to get below 1,000. What was even more interesting is I would measure in, like even before I got on the plane at the Jacksonville airport, I had a reading in the line of 950 where they were all stacked before the Southwest flight to get on, and that's a pretty high room, etc. But everyone was close together. So that was pretty high and close. But the amazing thing was on a Delta flight, on a 757-200 that was packed full, it was about 900 when we got on. I was a fairly early boarder, main one, and about in seat 22, which was about 5 from the entrance. And because a bunch went to the front in that plane and the rest of the rear. And I was on an aisle seat, and by the time we backed out and the plane had stopped and didn't start its jet motors for a while, jet engines, I got a reading of almost 2,400, which is really high, and that sort of stunned me. I think it was 2385, and ultimately it went down, but even on the flight, it stayed over 1,000 at about 13 to 1,400 again. So clearly, I don't know that the air is getting circulated as well in those airplanes as maybe we believed. Now, is that really bad? Probably not, but it does point to the fact that maybe there's more of an opportunity there to do a little better, or to potentially become infected on a plane.
Yeah, and I would say the other thing relative to that is, certainly from a cost basis, there was some reduction in the circulation of air to try and reduce the cost, because there's a cost associated with some of the settings in terms of heating, bringing in fresh air, and so forth. So I don't know. That's a little bit surprising, albeit, this is just Fred's data gathering experiment, but, still worthy of investigation. I'd love to learn more about this, and we'll certainly try and do that since you've now got the device, right?
Absolutely. And even in the conference rooms I was in, never went over 1,000 in those. And they did the
That's
adequate
great.
spacing and things like that. So that was nice to see, or the exhibit halls that I was in. So that was great. So the other big piece of news this week, and I know we've been talking about this, but really important, is children's vaccines. And where are we with those now?
Well, the good news is that the FDA have said, or have approved the Pfizer vaccine, so that kids from ages 5 to 11, so we had the older age group, 12 and up, had already been cleared. They've now approved it. They did struggle with it a little bit. And to be clear, it still has to then get ratified by the CDC to then authorize it. But that's excellent news. I know there's lots of parents who want to protect their children in the same way that we protected all the adults. The challenge certainly for parents here is to sort of take into account side effects and problems specifically with the vaccine. So it's a risk reward, as it is with everything. And the predominant thing that we've seen or heard about is myocarditis, so that's inflammation of the heart, and then multi-system inflammation symptoms in children, or MIS-C as it's abbreviated to. We've seen small numbers of this, and there was a relatively small study, not a large number of patients, that was published looking at those numbers in pediatrics. And the good news was the majority of them, all by the follow-up that they had achieved, had resolved all of the indications of that inflammation that was showing up. And it was showing up on MRI. So in some instances, you might not know unless they had any symptoms. All of that was resolving in the majority of those without any supportive therapy with inotrope. So, when we have people that have cardiac problems, we have to give them drugs. There was none of that, or no requirement. That doesn't mean say it's a zero risk like all of these things. So it does have to be taken into account. As with all these things, this is something that you have to have the conversation with your pediatrician who knows you, your family, your children, all of the circumstances. But the general guidance here is that the risk reward, very high. It is much more beneficial for the children to get vaccinated and not get the disease, specifically because there are some other sequelae around this, particularly around long COVID.
Yeah, we're really seeing the stuff around long COVID start to show up, and hopefully we'll get more studies to indicate just how frequently that occurs and how bad that might be for individuals. But obviously, some good news. Again, as you talked about, talk to your physician, I guess, is really the key with this, right?
Absolutely. Talk to your physician. They know you, your children. Make an informed decision. But the general guidance is vaccines work and they're safe in the 5 and up now, which is good news. We can now start to broaden the population that can be fully vaccinated.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much, Nick. Once again, great week. This is Fred Goldstein with Accountable Health. If you'd like more information, please go to accountablehealthllc.com.
And this is Dr. Nick. I'm the Incrementalist here with Incremental Insights for better business, better health.